Well, I'm very honoured to be asked to give this medal lecture, but slightly alarmed because, as was hinted at, I have not been doing much in the way of neuropsychiatry for a while. But I take heart from the advice that I was given by my Dr. Father, as they say in Germany, who was Hans Eysenck. And he told me that if you're speaking to psychologists, talk about physiology. And if you're speaking to physiologists, talk about psychology. The problem, of course, is that neuropsychiatrists know about both. But I've tried to solve it. So I'm going to talk about fish and bees and philosophy and, naturally enough, some Bayesian optimal decision-making will come in as well. But in particular, I've become fascinated more recently with what you might call social psychology and the advantages that we all know about, but are in some ways slightly magical, that you get from working with two minds rather than one. Now, the background to this is in order to survive in this world, we have to learn continuously. The world is changing all the time. It's not just a matter of learning these are the rules and you follow them, because the rules are changing and the possibilities are changing. And of course, one way to do this, the sort of well-studied way, is by trial and error. You try something, it doesn't work, you try again, but then at some point you'll probably be dead. So it's actually, you can do even better if you learn from others, and what I find particularly interesting, if you learn with others. And I'll try and explain what I mean by that. In fact, exploring the world with others is a striking feature of human culture, and you could say that the whole enterprise of science is perhaps the highest achievement of the possibility of learning about the world with others. And Charles Darwin is a good example of this. He explored the world with others. In the correspondence problem, they found that he has over 15,000 letters in the category of his working papers. And he maintained widespread contacts in Britain and overseas, and he was getting information from gardeners, explorers, ship's captains, anybody who had anything interesting to say. He would write to them, ask them questions, and collect all this together. And he was effectively integrating information from many different sources, and this gave him the advantage in developing his theory of evolution. Now, in fact, a little later, Francis Galton, I'm proud to say the statistician from UCL, empirically demonstrated the advantage of integrating information from many people. And here I'm showing you a preview of the graphic novel that Uta and I are writing about social cognition. And I have a nice little story. When I said to Professor Trimble that we were writing a graphic novel, he heard me to say pornographic novel, which maybe tells you something about his prior expectations. Anyway, this is the famous example where Galton went to a country fair. He saw that there was a guess the weight of an ox competition, and a light bulb lit up above his head, or I should say in his prefrontal cortex. And he went to the runners of the show, and he got all the papers about what each individual guesses were, and he should show that the mean guess was actually more accurate than the winning guess. So that the wisdom of the crowd was actually a more accurate representation of the information that was available. So by integrating information from more than one person, we can actually acquire more accurate knowledge of the world and make better decisions. Now, this is not a uniquely human ability. Many animals get advantages from working in groups. So, for example, pairs of homing pigeons will navigate better than either pigeon on its own. And a shoal of fish can follow a trail of scent that is too weak a signal for an individual fish to follow. So where does this advantage come from? Why does integrating information across members of a group work so well? Well, one advantage is through signal averaging. So for each individual, they have some measure of the signal, but it's very noisy. So the signal-to-noise ratio is too low to be actually useful for an individual. But if we assume that the noise is roughly equal in each individual and is uncorrelated, so that each person has, or fish has slightly different noise, then if you average across individuals, it reduces the noise and increases the signal-to-noise ratio. This is well known, for example, in EEG evoked potentials. That's the whole basis of producing these, revealing the signal by averaging and reducing the noise. And here's just one example. There's one individual, you can hardly see anything, but where you have 9 individuals averaged together, the signal begins to emerge. This is also the basis of Condorcet's jury theorem. As long as each individual in the jury has a slightly better than chance of giving the right answer, then the more people involved in making a majority decision, the better that decision will be. Unfortunately, there's an obvious problem here. A shoal of fish doesn't have a Galton to work out the average of their behavior, or a jury foreman to count the votes. So you can very properly ask the question, how is information integrated across individuals and then fed back to the group if you haven't got this central high-level monitoring device? And the answer is the problem is solved by the automatic alignment of individuals within the group. So how is this alignment achieved? This is, for example, a shoal of fish. Their shoaling behavior depends on very simple rules. Remain close to your neighbors, avoid collisions with your neighbors, move in the same direction as your neighbors. This produces physical alignment. And this is an example of the sort of alignment you see. This is a flock of starlings over the coast of West Jutland, or Jutland, I guess I should call it, and I remember in the olden days that there used to be flocks like this in Leicester Square, but they've all gone. It's very sad. And this is a very elegant computer simulation using just 3 simple rules for this flock to coordinate where they're chasing the green ball and they're avoiding the red ball. And you can produce this amazingly synchronized behavior just from 3 very simple rules. Of course, and even quite complex behavior such as hunting can emerge from simple rules of alignment. So if somebody's shown using simulations that wolf pack hunting behavior, which involves tracking the prey, pursuing and encircling it, can emerge from 2 rules. Keep a minimum safe distance from the prey, move away from the other rules. That results in you surrounding the prey and attacking it. There is no need either for communication or a leader. It simply arises from the alignment. And this is also demonstrated to be how it works in the case of the fish, who are each trying to follow this very weak signal. But the top 2 lines shows you the fish are constantly, it's called taxis, they move backwards and forwards like this in a sort of random manner, and you can just about see it superimposed on top of the basic signal here. But because their random movements are uncorrelated, if they all align themselves together, the signal is actually revealed and the shoal as a whole goes up the gradient to indicate where the food is. And of course, physical alignment can be seen in human groups. This is the very famous road crossing in the middle of Tokyo, which not only what is remarkable here is that they not only people aligning to cross together, but also are able to pass each other without bumping into each other. This is all due to these very basic rules of physical alignment. But humans, of course, don't just show automatic mental alignment. They can align much more abstract things like affordances, which I will explain in a moment, goals and knowledge. So 2 people doing the same task or sharing a task will align their goals. 2 people in a room together will align their knowledge. So if I can see that you can only see 1 dot, whereas I can see 2 dots in the room, then I take account of that automatically, and I'm in a sense, I'm aligning my knowledge of what's in the room with your knowledge of what's in the room. And this sort of alignment is obviously very important for coordinating group actions. Let me just show you the case of alignment of affordances. So this is Mr. Blue, sitting at the table, and the 4 red mugs are red because they're within his reach. And that is said to give them an affordance. These are things he can actually handle and grasp. And you can, the fact that there's a mug within your reach actually affects your motor cortex. So the appearance of a mug within your reach will actually partially activate the system that would grasp this mug, although you don't actually do it. But you can see an increase in motor activity if you use TMS. But if another person appears, then this mug, which is in reach of Mr. Red, is now also an affordant mug for Mr. Blue because it's available for the group. So instead of the bright cups are now within reach of both members of the group, and this is an example of what Mattia Gallotti and I call the we mode. So you're not representing which mugs are within my reach, you're representing which mugs are within our reach. So that would be an alignment of affordances. And then I said you can demonstrate this using TMS. So this is a situation where on the other side of the table there's just a wooden cylinder, and you get much greater affordance measured by the, as I said, the facilitation of motor cortex, which you can measure with TMS for the mug that's within your reach compared to the mug that's not in your reach. But when a human avatar appears in the picture, then the mug that was non-reachable now has as high an affordance as the one that was reachable. So you can actually see this happening in the brain. Actually, I was going to say one of the things I was going to say one of my strategies, of course, will not be to mention the brain, but I realize I have, so I apologize for that. Yeah. But there is actually more to integration across agents than simple alignment. The signals from some agents may be more important or reliable than others, and we should put more weight on these signals. And a very nice example of this comes from the study of bees. So, as you know, the bees from time to time will swarm so that half the hive leaves, goes off with the queen, lands in a tree somewhere, and a few hundred scout bees sent out, or go out, I should say, to search for new nest sites. And they return, and they give their waggle dance, which tells you where the site is. And the longer dances indicate higher quality sites. And they can actually estimate quality. They go to the site, they go inside, they measure how big it is by flying back and forth. They know how high up the tree is. So they have 3 or 4 ways of measuring how good the site is. And they come back, and the longer the dance, the better the site is. And the longer dances recruit more scouts. And if they agree, you get a positive feedback loop. So eventually most of the scouts are going to the best site. And then after an hour or two, the whole hive, the whole swarm goes off to that site. And in this example, signals of better sites are given, which is the length of the dance, are given greater weight. And this, of course, is basic Bayesian optimal signal integration in action. So if you have 2 reports from 2 scouts about the direction, possible direction of a site, you know not only what the direction is the scout is telling you, you know how good his estimate is, which is essentially the standard deviation of the distribution, and you give more weight to the scout with better information indicated by the longer dance, so that your optimal location is not in between the 2 signals, but is nearer to the signal with the smallest standard deviation or greater precision, which is given by this simple formula below, which is essentially the Bayesian optimal way of combining signals. And I say 1 over sigma here is, which is standard deviation, we now like to call precision. I say we, I mean me and Carl. Yeah. So humans can also weight signals on the basis of precision. And this is some work that I'm particularly excited about, started a little while ago by Bahadur Barami, which we call social psychophysics, asking the question, are 2 observers better than 1? And those, the psychophysicists among you will know that this task is a 2-interval, forced choice, oddball contrast detection task. So you have 2 intervals in time. In each interval, you see these 6 Gabor patches. In one of the intervals, one of the 6 patches is an odd one out because the contrast between the stripes is slightly different. And you can adjust it very finely to make it more or less difficult. So this is the task, 2 people. Now, this is a typical psychophysics task, which standardly is extremely boring to do because you have to do thousands of trials. And you can tell that it's boring to do because when you read in the Journal of Vision these experiments, you'll find that there are 3 authors, and very strangely, the initials of the 3 subjects are the same as those of the 3 authors. But if you do social psychophysics, everything changes because we now have 2 people doing it together. So they see the pictures, they make an individual decision, they indicate whether they thought it was in the first or the second interval, and if they disagree, they have a discussion, and then they come up with a joint decision. This changes the nature of the task completely. People enjoy doing it now, and you have no difficulty in getting subjects, which is lucky because you need twice as many as you would normally need. So they're given feedback, and then you can actually ask the question, how well did they do in terms of the individual decisions, and how well do they do with the joint decision? And what you find, but the first question you should ask, of course, is how are they going to combine their decisions? And there are sort of 3 strategies, roughly speaking. They could toss a coin. In this case, the average decision, group decision, will be halfway between the better and the worse person. They could always choose the response of the better performer, in which case the joint decision would be equivalent to that of the better performer on his own. Or they can do what we call weighted confidence sharing, and this is bringing back confidence, which Kathy was talking about in the previous talk, which is very important. So in this case, you choose the response of the more confident partner on a trial-by-trial basis. So the confidence is an indication of how good your perception of the signal was. And my simple-minded version of this is if you're doing a task like this, your concentration is bound to lapse from time to time, and you will miss the signal. But also, because you're uncorrelated, it's very unlikely that your confidence in both people will lapse at the same time. So if you know when your confidence has lapsed, you can always pick out which is the better person. But the clever people I work with, in particular Peter Latham, can turn this into a Bayesian equation, and they can actually predict what the optimum performance should be if you do weighted confidence sharing and if you know the precision of the 2 people individually. On the basis of their precision, you can predict what their optimum performance should be. Anyway, what you find very strikingly in now several experiments, that the joint decision is indeed better than the decision of the best person in each pair. And it indeed approaches optimality. And this is the data presented in a slightly strange way. So on the y-axis, you have the advantage. That is to say, 1 means that you're doing no better than the better person in the group. If it's more than 1, you're doing better than the better person in the group. And it's less than 1, you're doing worse than the better person in the group. And along the x-axis, you have the ratio of how good the 2 people were. So at this end, they're both equal in ability. And at this end, one of them is much worse than the other. And what this clearly shows is particularly when they're roughly equal ability, there is an advantage. They're doing better as a group than they would as the best individual. And this is the weighted confidence sharing prediction from the weighted confidence sharing model, which is a remarkably good fit. And I should, at this point, boast, for those of you who are interested in model fitting, this model has no free parameters. You can't fiddle about to make it better or worse. It's either like that or it's not. So we're quite encouraged by that. What you should notice, of course, is that if you're working with someone who is worse than you, then the group decision will be worse. So be very careful how you choose your collaborators. Now, interestingly, this was all done in Denmark, but you'll be pleased to know I've translated it into English, and they collected precisely what the people said to each other when they were making their decisions, and our friends in semiotics analyzed this in great detail, and they were able to show that you got the group advantage as long as the main point of discussion between the 2 people is confidence. How confident were we? If they discuss which of us is better, or which of us is the more important and should give the answer. That doesn't work. They have to talk about confidence, and they all come up with scales, verbal scales for describing different levels of confidence. Interestingly, they're virtually all different. Every pair comes up with slightly different words. None of them use numbers, but that's probably because they weren't professional psychophysics studies. And the more rapidly they developed a stable set of expressions for defining different levels of confidence, the greater the group advantage was. Somewhat to my surprise, the average number in this scale for describing confidence was 18, whereas, as we know from George Miller, it should have been between 5 and 7. But people seem to produce very fine scales for describing confidence. And I've given you a couple of examples from 2 different pairs. So one pair had things like, I thought I saw it, I didn't see a thing. Another pair might say, except in Danish, almost sure, very unsure. So they're producing these scales for talking about confidence. Now, this is very interesting because to report on our confidence and what we have just seen involves what we call metacognition, that is to say, the ability to reflect upon our mental processes. And metacognition has been studied for a long time, particularly in relation to teaching and education. So, for example, it's important for students to know what they don't know when they start revising for an exam. But more recently, metacognition has been put into the signal detection framework, which gives you very useful objective ways for measuring it and researching on it. So I've given you here the typical signal detection diagram. So here we have the signal that you're trying to detect, which has noise around it. So that's the mean signal, but you could get something like that or something like that. And the dotted line is the noise distribution where there's no signal, so it's just the noise without the signal. And obviously right up here, if you get a signal that intensity, you're absolutely certain it's a signal. And if you get a signal similar to that intensity, you're certain it's noise. And you have to decide where you will set your criterion. You can have your sensitivity, which is the difference between the 2 distributions, and you will set your criterion somewhere here, depending on whether you want to avoid missing signals or you want to avoid thinking there are signals when there weren't any there. And this is so you have the discrimination signal, how good are you at distinguishing signal from noise, and you have your bias, which is are you conservative or liberal in choosing whether to say signal or noise. You have exactly the same thing at the metacognitive level. So at the metacognitive level, the question is not, did you see a signal or not? The question is, was your response correct or not? And of course, here you need 2 criteria, because if you're right way out here, you would say, yes, I think it was a signal and I'm confident I'm right. And if you were way down here, you would say, yes, I'm pretty sure it's noise and I think I'm right. Whereas in the middle, this is where you're unsure. So you might say, I was guessing at this point. And then you can ask the question, how good are people actually discriminating between their correct answers and their wrong answers? So you get a discriminability score, and you also get a bias, which is quite independent of this. So you have the overconfident people who think they're usually right, and you have the underconfident people who think they're usually wrong, even though their actual ability to discriminate is the same. So the overconfident person is not bad at making the discrimination, he's just biased in a certain direction. And there's a lot of talk about how accurate our metacognition is, and I think you've got strange discrepancies. So people working in this psychophysics end of confidence in seeing funny signals in peculiar tasks, on the whole concluded that people's metacognition was rather accurate. Whereas the people working in the more educational system, where they were saying, how good do you think you are at this task, said that people's metacognition was rather bad. I think the reason for this discrepancy is that they were looking at different things. So we indeed are rather good in our metacognitive accuracy, distinguishing correct trials from incorrect trials. But at the same time, we can have very unrealistic biases, being consistently overconfident or underconfident. Now, this is a problem, as I'm sure you'll have noticed for my story about the weighted confidence sharing, Because if you're working with an overconfident person, you will give him too much weight and your performance will not be so good as it could be. And you can see this is from Dan Bang's work, where he actually asked lots of people working on their own to give confidence ratings. And this simply shows that some people are consistently underconfident. So given a 6-point scale, they'll mostly use 1, 2, and 3, where other people are consistently overconfident. So the same scale, they will consistently use 4, 5, and 6. And clearly, if they work together, and all things remaining the same, too much weight will be given to this person who will say he's confident in a signal he didn't quite see, whereas his partner is saying he's not confident in a signal he did see. Now, interestingly, this problem seems to be almost automatically resolved, because when people work together, they actually align their confidence reports. So this is data collected by Dan Bang of so each dot is a pair of people doing the task. And what you can see is there's a very high correlation, probably because it was done in Denmark. They tend to be at the underconfident end of the scale. But they are very highly agreeing. They're both very underconfident, or in this case, they're both very overconfident. And as long as they're aligning their use of confidence in this way, they will still get the advantage because they've matched their confidence. When somebody says, I'm more confident than you, it will actually mean that they've detected the signal better. And that's fine as long as they are roughly equally competent. Interestingly, if they're not equally competent and they align their confidence scales in this way, then they will do worse. And there's evidence that this happens, which I'm not going to tell you about this moment. So what this shows, I think, is this explicit metacognition, the ability to talk about our cognitive experiences, is very malleable. We can certainly alter the way that we report our confidence, depending on the situation we're in. And I suspect, but have yet to prove, that it may even affect our experience of confidence. If I'm working with someone and I keep finding that I'm not very confident, but I think this is the answer, and he's very confident and he's wrong, I'm going to feel more and more confident about my answers. So I think it feeds right down to your experience, not just how you choose to report it. And I think this is not surprising because just as we have to learn to interpret all the signals that come in from the world, we also have to learn to interpret the signals that come in from inside, the signals that tell us about our internal states and our cognitive processes. So this is an example of the sorts of thing that's going on. So down here at the subpersonal level, actually, this is what I have learned, useful things from philosophers, the use of the distinction personal and subpersonal. So subpersonal is a euphemism for what the brain does, and personal is a euphemism for what people do. And they are both euphemisms for conscious versus unconscious, which, of course, we don't like to talk about things like that. So I talk about the personal and the subpersonal level. And at the subpersonal level, you have a typical situation like this, very much based on Tim Challis's contention scheduling system. So you have sensations coming in which indicate various courses of action, and they all compete with each other, and the best course of action wins because that's where the bottleneck is, and some action is produced. It's recently been shown that at this subpersonal level, we also monitor the reliability of our senses. So, for example, we automatically take account that vision tends to be more reliable than touch, so we give more weight to the reliable senses and less to the unreliable senses. And all this goes into producing automatic behavior. But at the personal level, some signals from the underlying system here become conscious or available for report, and information about how this low-level cognitive processes are working, you can actually talk about, experience, and discuss. So what sort of signals might these be? So these are the sorts of properties of cognitive processes that are available for monitoring at this meta level. Unexpected errors. People slow down after making errors. This means that they've monitored the error and that they've taken action to prevent it happening again. Action selection fluency. This is the feeling of how easy it was for you to choose the current action, or was there some confusion? And Patrick Haggard's group has shown that this determines our feeling of control. if the action selection feels fluent, we feel more in control of our actions. Perceptual fluency is very similar. If you've seen a picture before, it's much easier to perceive it the next time. The presentation gets into your awareness, you know what it is more quickly, and you're aware of knowing what it is more quickly. This is interesting because a long time ago, science showed this interesting paradoxical result. If you show people lots and lots of pictures and then show them pairs, one they've seen before and one they haven't, if you ask them which one did you see before, they're at chance. If you ask them which one do you like better, they choose the one they've seen before. And more recent research has shown that this is determined by perceptual fluency. You like things that you perceive more fluently. So in this case, the evidence is there, the perceptual fluency is available, but it's misinterpreted. They don't realize it means you've seen it before. They think it means you like it. So this is an example of where these signals are misinterpreted, and presumably you could teach people to use them in a different way. And that's what I'm going to suggest. So I suggest that we learn to interpret these explicit signals from our inner mental world with the help of other people. And for example, we have vivid experiences of causing things through our actions, called the sense of agency. But as Dan Wegner has shown, we can have illusions of agency. We can easily be made to think we have caused something which somebody else caused, or even more in the case of facilitated communication, which I won't go into, you can believe that somebody else has caused something which you have actually caused. And again, Patrick Haggard has invented this measure, or discovered this measure, intentional binding, which provides an objective measure of our sense of agency. So when you cause an action, the time between pressing the button and the outcome feels shorter than if you didn't cause the action. But it's been shown that if this intentional binding is increased, that is, you get a greater sense of agency tested empirically when people are persuaded that they're a cause of an effect that they haven't actually caused. So again, these are very malleable. And I think this relates to the sense of agency and responsibility. So one of the advantages of being in All Souls for a couple of years, I learned a great deal about Hellenistic philosophy. And the sense of agency for Epicurus, for example, is the basis for moral responsibility. You're responsible if you were in control, if you actually caused the action. And again, more recently, from using Patrick Haggard's method, intentional binding, the feeling of agency is increased when the consequences have a moral rather than economic consequence. Most people, this is experimental philosophy, which is not what I do, which is where you go out and ask the folk the question rather than sitting in your chair. Most people believe that free will and moral responsibility are intimately connected. And in many societies, we bear more responsibility for outcomes that are caused deliberately rather than accidentally. I think this is something we learn about. But here's some evidence from this from Tanya Singer's work. So these were people who were doing a trust game. So you're giving money to somebody and he may give it back with interest or he may keep it. And in this particular version, you were allowed to reward or punish people on the basis of what they did. And these graphs here show that people who shared the money 50-50 got lots of reward points, and people who kept it all for themselves got lots of punishment points. And it didn't matter whether they were doing this to you or to somebody else you were observing. But the interesting point is these lines here, these people were behaving exactly the same way, but the participants had been told they were not doing it deliberately. They were just reading off a computer printout that the experimenter had given them that told them what to do on each trial. And in this case, since they were not doing it deliberately, they were not punished or rewarded, even though their behavior was exactly the same. And I should say this is probably the basis of social cohesion. People like Ernst Fair have shown that the people's ability to share and to benefit from group sharing requires that you're allowed to punish the free riders. This is so-called altruistic punishment. And of course, you punish people when they do it deliberately rather than accidentally. But this is not universally the case. If I'm right about these things being determined by learning and so on, we might expect that there are cultural differences in the experience of responsibility. And recent work in anthropologists Among the Mop and Myers of Central America, they find that punishment is based on the degree of damage rather than the degree of intentionality. It doesn't matter whether it was an accident or not, you will be punished in exactly the same way. To the extent that saying a falsehood is not excused even if at the time the speaker believed it to be true, and children who indulge in pretend play are reproved. This is not the right thing to do. You have to stick with reality, not with intentionality. So is the experience of agency and responsibility learned from our culture? And what I want to show you now is some experiments showing that our interpretation of metacognitive signals can be altered by gossip and instructions. So this is going back to the trust game. So these games, you're putting money into a system, and you learn that some people can be trusted and some people cannot be trusted. And you do this by a simple learning algorithm. If you get back more money than you expected, your trust in the person goes up. If you get less money than you expected, your trust in the person goes down. And these prediction errors can actually be seen as activity in the caudate nucleus here. So you're monitoring whether you should change your level of trust, and this is reflected in brain activity. The interesting thing is that you can do a slightly different version where you tell them in advance, this is a very trustworthy person you're playing with. He, in his spare time, he goes and helps old people, and he once managed to rescue a friend from a fire in a nightclub, and he's a really good person. Or some opposite scenario. If you do that, you find that they cease to pay that much attention to the prediction errors. They've actually downweighted this. And there are now several experiments, both in the brain and in purely behavioral, so that participants continue to rely on their prior information about trustworthiness, even though experience sheds doubt on their accuracy. So telling someone about how trustworthy somebody is means that you pay less attention to their actual behavior. And slightly disturbingly, in the experiments by Malinsky and Sommerfeld, they found that this gossip worked even if it came from an untrustworthy person. Another example of this is this famous phenomenon of ego depletion, which is the idea that if you have to sit next to a plate of marshmallows or something and you're not allowed to eat them, this requires all sorts of executive function activity, and it, in a sense, tires you out. So after this terrible experience, you'll be bad at executive tasks like the Stroop task. This, it turns out, is all a matter of belief. So these people had two groups. In fact, they did several experiments. But one group is told working on a strenuous mental task can make you feel tired such that you need a break before accomplishing a new task. The other group were told sometimes working on a strenuous mental task can make you feel energized for further challenging abilities. So this is a situation where they had done this depleting task in advance and then did the Stroop task. And the people who'd been told they would be tired made more errors on the Stroop task. And the people who'd been told they would be energized by this experience made fewer errors on the Stroop task. So I'm suggesting that this is you're being taught how to interpret this feeling I have after having done this executive task. And it can produce completely opposite behavior. So this is explicit metacognition, and the important thing is it actually enables a two-way process. So I've already talked about that the signals arriving from the subpersonal level can be converted into representations which we can actually communicate to other people. But at the same time, communications from other people can produce top-down effects on the way our own subpersonal processes work. So the critical thing about this explicit metacognition is it has this two-way aspect. We can change the beliefs of others about how the brain works, and they can change our beliefs about how the brain works. And these two features of explicit metacognition, that is to say, making a mental representation public and internalizing a mental version of a public representation, according to Dan Sperber, are the basis of cultural transmission. So this is a key aspect of human cognition, which makes cumulative culture possible. Some examples of it, sort of more cultural level. You can weaken people's belief in free will by telling them things like Francis Crick said that most rational people now recognize that free will is an illusion, and since Francis Crick said it must be true. And exposure to such statements increases antisocial tendencies like cheating, reduces helping and increases aggression, and reduces self-control. Well, I'd say it reduces belief in self-control. So here's some pretty impressive data. So I've already told you about post-error slowing. If you're doing a choice reaction time task, if you make an error, you'll be slowed down on the next trial, obviously to try avoid making errors. But if you tell people that free will doesn't exist, the post-error slowing is reduced. It's as if they decided there's no point in monitoring this, it won't make any difference, I can't help it. And at the same time, there's a reduction in the amplitude of the readiness potential. So I find this particularly exciting. I would like to know how on earth does changing your belief in free will affect this really deep level of brain functioning? That's one of my current projects. And of course, what is interesting about action and our experiences of action seem to have rather little influence on the control of the action that we are currently doing, but it seems to be very important for justifying why we did it after people afterwards. And you can see how justifications of behavior of this kind can create social norms. So my friend Dean Mobbs was involved in this experiment, which is really a version of the trolley problem called pain versus gain. So the participants is given a sum of money, and they're told they can give it away to prevent someone else receiving a painful shock, or they can keep it, or they can share it. When this is done hypothetically, they say, what would you do? 93% of American students say they would give all the money to the person so they wouldn't have any pain. When they do it in real life, 100% keep some of the money. And this is the sort of thing they say, I wanted the money, but I didn't want to hurt him. I decided he could take a little pain and I could make a little money. That seems fair. So this example of justifying behavior generates beliefs about self-control, shapes the sense of self, gives rise to concepts like responsibility and fairness. And of course, the loop is then closed because these cultural beliefs are fed back to influence the behavior of the person. So explicit metacognition has a critical role in creating advantages for interacting minds. Its reportability allows minds to share experiences. The malleability and fallibility of our interpretations of metacognitive signals enables the top-down effects of culture on brain and behavior. And experiences of things like agency and responsibility create social cohesion and cumulative culture. And in a sense, consensus is more important than accuracy. So I'm not going to commit myself as to whether or not we have free will, but I would commit myself to saying the general belief that we have free will and consensus that we have free will is very important for social cohesion in general. But you ask, I hear you cry, what about psychosis? This is my last point, and I think this is interesting, but obviously we need more time and money, as Kathy has reminded us. It's striking to me that both aspects of explicit metacognition are impaired during an episode of psychosis. And we all know that patients lack insight and have difficulty in describing their experiences to others. But there's the other side of the coin also. The delusions are hard to change. The patient's beliefs are no longer affected by the opinions of others and of their culture. So is the key problem really at this explicit level of metacognition? And this is, I would like to explore the neural underpinnings and the cognitive mechanisms on which this explicit form of metacognition depends. So thank you very much. These are some of the people who've helped develop these ideas, and these are the authors of the graphic novel showing that why two minds are better than one.
Thank you very much, Chris. That was just as wonderful as expected. Whilst people are about to ask some questions, and I don't doubt there will be some, can I just do the nicer part, which is to award you your medal?
There really is a medal.
There isn't. Because we decided that medals just get left in drawers, so we've given you whiskey tumblers, which are much more valuable.
Thank you very much.
And some of the all-important water of life to go with it. So, excellent. It's got utility value. Questions? Narooj, do you want to just wait for the mic so people at the back?
I'll ask one quickly whilst we're waiting, if that's okay. I was very interested in two pairs, obviously you get better performance, but people trialled bigger numbers, and how does that affect? So 3, 4, 5 people, what happens with increasing numbers?
There is a little bit of work on that, and as you would expect, it asymptotes out. So after 3 or 4, at least with this kind of task, it probably is not going to give you a sufficient advantage. But we're obviously currently very interested in why committees, I was going to say work, why committees don't work, which usually have more numbers, and there are all sorts of interesting reasons why this working together can go wrong, which we're writing a paper about, which I hope will explain some of these problems. But one thing I didn't mention is that if you put 2 people together with different abilities, they will automatically align, and actually the performance gets worse than it should. And this seems to be a cultural universal. It happens in China, Iran, and Denmark. And you can't have more different societies than those. In every case, you get this Dunning-Kruger effect. So the competent person is slightly underconfident, and the incompetent person is very overconfident. And I don't know, the Dunning-Kruger phenomena is the less competent you are, the more confident you are. And this is a major thing that we have to cope with.
Very interesting and thought-provoking talk. I've got 2 questions. They're kind of comments and question in one. If the group is more accurate than an individual, then should we be having more referendum as a nation? And secondly, more practically, because many of us do medical legal reports, and there was a trend and thought that we should have single joint expert reports. Should we be sticking with the old system where there are 2 experts involved? Because 2 minds are better than 1.
I think certainly at the bottom end of this, where you're talking about relatively few people working together, I would be inclined to think that joint reports should be better. You obviously have the problem that somebody has to write the final version. Otherwise, you get horrible mismatches. With regard to referenda, I think I think there are countries like Switzerland, but I think that depends again on the matter of scale. So I believe they have referenda within each canton, which is a relatively small unit. But the other problem, of course, is who decides what the question is. That should probably be a group decision. Yeah.
Thanks for a brilliant talk, Chris. I want to go back to the basic finding with Barami about this confidence-weighted sharing information leading to better performance in the group. I'm wondering whether that also leads to better metacognitive performance in the group. If you, for instance, take the average confidence response for the group and the average response of the group, is that more metacognitively accurate too? And can you use that as perhaps a feedback signal so the individuals can improve their metacognition?
Yes, we've thought about this a great deal, and it turns out to be a sort of technical problem. So there are 2 things. First of all, we would hope that people's individual metacognitive accuracy might get better by working in a group. And secondly, as you say, the group metacognitive accuracy might be better too. The problem is that, at least in this task, the correlation between metacognitive accuracy and object level accuracy is so high that you can't really separate them out. But what is interesting is that when they work in a group, their signal detection not only is better than the individual, but it continually increases even without feedback, even though they're not told whether they were actually right or wrong, which is very interesting.
That's interesting because your type 2 D prime often goes down over time.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. I was just wondering, you made a comment at the end about post-error slowing after making an error is reduced if you've told you've got no free will. And if someone authoritative says that, actually you have got free will, then it changes. I just wondered if that could be an explanation for functional neurological disorders, because you saw an actual electrophysiological change. I just wondered if you'd had any comments or opinions about that.
No, I would agree with this. This is certainly touching on things like placebo effects, which is basically people who are telling you things and then it changes your behavior. And I think that could well relate to some of these phenomenon. It is, of course, very disturbing for a psychologist because it means that the way that people behave in your experiments depends on what they believe about the experiment and may explain some of the failures to replicate because the experimenter is subtly indicating how they want the person to behave and what they want the person to experience. So it means we have to be much more cautious about or careful about how we design our experiments and how we instruct our subjects. I mean, I'm trying to avoid this by saying what I'm interested in is how instructions work. Yeah.
We better make this the last question because we can go on all day, I suspect.
I'm thinking, I want to ask if there's a judicial application of these psychophysics ideas that, for example, I serve on mental health tribunals, and one of the issues is the standard of proof. I mean, is the person in front of you going to kill his mother, basically, if we release him from hospital? And it's all very well, having a proof of what someone has done, but we're looking at a proof of what someone might do. And the discussion between the three, observers, the judges, are very interesting. I wonder if you had any thoughts about that.
Well, I think in a sense, this is why we have juries. But yes, I think discussions between three would be much better than having just one patient making the decision. This is not relevant to your question, but what I'm struck by in thinking about the judicial system, because I'm a Bayesian, I believe that your prior knowledge is extremely important in actually perceiving what's going on in the world, except in relation to pornographic novels. But it is fascinating that in the English judicial system, you're not allowed to know about the previous behavior of the accused, though this is probably the best predictor of whether they're guilty or not and what they're going to do next.
Thank you very much, Chris.